Whether you're new to Substance Designer or looking to expand your texture style palette, this next material is sort of a rite of passage when it comes to texture making. Today, we're going to make this stylized brick wall texture. We'll go through the entire process from beginning to end, while also explaining the reasoning behind certain choices that add more realism to our end result. Let's get started. Okay, so we're in Substance Designer. Let's create a new substance. Okay, I'm going to choose the PBR Metallic Roughness template, and let's call this Stylized Brick Wall. Let's keep the size mode to absolute and the width and height at 2K, and we're going to make sure it's on 16 bits per channel. All right, let's hit OK. All right, so here's how I have my layout of Substance Designer. It might look a little bit different if you're just opening it up for the first time, but what you can do is you can drag these panels around. So you probably have something similar. What I'm just going to do is I'm just going to drag my 2D view over here to the left and my 3D view below that, and then just resize it a little bit so that we have more real estate so I can show you more of the graph editor, but we can also take a look at what's going on in the 2D view and the 3D view here. I also have my Explorer down here in the corner. You probably have it on the left side here. I have it down here because it's nice and small and I can keep access to my parameters. And we got this nice big graph view in the middle. So we've got our graph here and a couple of things are happening. So we have our outputs automatically hooked up and we have some defaults here. And the first thing I like to do when I set up a graph is a couple things. First of all, we're going to go to the Materials menu in the 3D view. So we'll go to Materials, Default, Physically, Metallic, Roughness, Tessellation. So we choose Tessellation here. And then we're going to go and increase the tessellation factor all the way up to 16. And I'm going to add a tiny bit of scale, let's say somewhere around 2-ish. And so now when we add height to our texture, it's going to displace the geometry on this cube here. The next thing I like to do is I'm going to hit spacebar and I'm going to add a blend node. And I'm going to hook this blend node up to a bunch of these outputs so that all I need to do is input something into this blend node's foreground and it'll chain react to the rest of these nodes that I'm using. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the output of this blend and put it into this normal map here. Don't worry about it being red, it's going to change in a little bit. Then I'm going to go to where it says ambient occlusion down here and I'm going to delete this uniform color and I'm going to hit spacebar and add an ambient occlusion node here. And I'm going to hook that up to it. And then I'm going to take this blend and also output it to this ambient occlusion. Next, I'm going to go down to my height output here, and I'm going to delete this uniform color, and I'm going to import this blend into the height. So you should have this blend going into the normal here, which goes into the normal output, and also the ambient occlusion node into our ambient occlusion output, and straight into the height output. So first off, I'm going to go hit spacebar and add a tile sampler. We're going to use tile sampler a lot in this tutorial. So if we go to our tile sampler and we look at our properties here, I'm going to change the X and Y amount. So you can see the X and Y amount give us more or less of these squares in this case. So I'm going to choose 3 for the X, and for the Y, let's go with 6. Now keep the Y amount even so that this texture can tile. If I zoom out here and hit the spacebar, you can see how this texture will tile, and it's going to tile evenly. If I scroll down here and I go to position and I change the offset to something even like 0.5, you can see how this is tiling. But if I change my pattern amount to something like 5, you can see we get this weird tiled effect because you can see that we have this equal offset here, and that's because our texture ends here. It's the same on the top as it is on the bottom, and it's just going to repeat everywhere. So what we're going to do is just keep it an even number, and you can't see the tiling. So I'm going to hit spacebar again, zoom in with the middle mouse wheel, and if I hook this up into my foreground of the blend, immediately you can see we have something going on. It's displacing the geometry, and we've got the basis of what our texture is going to be. So in the tile sampler, I'm going to go to pattern, and I'm going to choose brick. And that's it, you're done. Just kidding. Okay, so we go into the pattern specific setting, and this adjusts based on what pattern you have selected here. So in brick, if you slide this up, you start to see that these bricks start to get sort of a rounded shape to them. You can see we're getting a roundness in the height here. I'm only going to set this just by a little bit, maybe something like 0.14. Then I'm going to scroll down a little bit, and I'm going to increase the overall scale. So if we increase that, you can see it's very sensitive. If we increase that just a little bit to something like 1.01, we can see that our bricks are now closer together and there's less of a gap between them. So this is the basis for our texture. So next up, I'm going to do something that might seem a bit counterintuitive, and you'll see why in the future, but I'm going to create the grout between the bricks next. So let's bring back our tile sampler here. Give us some room. And I'm going to select the connection that's coming right after the tile sampler by just selecting it like this. And this is going to allow me to input a node in between the tile sampler and this blend. It's really easy. Click and drag, then hit spacebar, and I'm going to choose an invert grayscale. And that's just going to flip this. So now you can see that we've just got this space in between our bricks showing up here. I want to add a sense of gravity and weight to this material. So when a bricklayer builds up a brick wall, they would lay down a brick and then they would spread the grout on top of that brick, which is more like a liquidy paste at the time. And this paste was a bit more susceptible to gravity before it quickly hardened and took its lifelong shape. So we're going to replicate this with a directional warp. It's really important to understand the physical process a material undergoes in the real world so that you can better replicate it in 3D. So I'm going to add, in between the final blend here and the invert grayscale, a directional warp. Now, directional warp takes two inputs. One is what you're trying to warp, and two is the intensity of how much you want to warp this by. So I'm going to warp this with a purlin noise. So I'm going to hit spacebar, purlin noise. We got our noise here. I'm going to input this into the intensity input of our directional warp, and immediately you can see what's happening here. It's pushing our shape here based on this purlin noise. So what I can do is if I double click the purlin noise and I go to the scale parameter, I can drag it down to almost increase the scale of the purlin noise in a way. So I'm going to choose something along the lines of 13. That looks fine. And if I go to the directional warp and single click, I can change the intensity. So if I bring this up, it's going to warp it even more. And also the angle that I'm warping it by. So because I want this grout to be drooping a little bit, I want to change the warp angle so that it's going up and down. And if you hold the shift key, it's going to lock into these increments here. So it's going to lock facing down. And that's how you know you have exactly minus 90 on the degrees here. So for the intensity, I'm going to bring it down just a bit because that was just a bit too much. And you can see what it's doing to our grout now. So next up what I want to do is I'm going to, after the directional warp, I'm going to add another blend. And I'm going to set this blend in the blending mode to add. You see we automatically got our directional warp into the background of our blend. In the foreground, I'm actually going to take the invert grayscale that we had before. And this is the bricks before they were directionally warped. So I'm going to put that into the foreground. And what this does is it adds on the previous shape on top of this warp shape, and it thickens up the grout a little bit. Now you can see we've got some spaces in here, so I'm going to inflate this grout material using what's called a non-uniform blur. So let's make some more room, bring things over. You can see we have our outputs and our final blend over here, and our working stuff over here. And I'm going to add in a non-uniform blur grayscale. And for the inputs, I'm actually going to use the same blend for both the grayscale input and the blur map. If I go to my non-uniform blur and I bring up the samples and the blades, and you can adjust the intensity here. And if I bring down the intensity now, it looks like it kind of blew up our grout like a balloon in a way. It's inflating it, giving it more of a softer shape here. So increase the samples and blades, and I'm going to take the intensity and I'm going to, yes, I'm just going to keep the intensity kind of low. And that kind of gave us our thicker shape along with the droopiness of that directional warp. Okay, so up next, I want to add just a tiny bit of surface detail to our grout. I know we're doing a stylized brick material, but I do want to add some sort of tactile feel to this. So one way to do that is to blend in a noise onto it. I'm going to make some more room. After the non-uniform blur grayscale, I'm going to add a blend. And for the foreground, I'm going to hit spacebar here and search for spots. And I'm going to get a black and white spots 1 here, and that's the texture I want. So I'm going to leave it as is, but I'm going to take its output and put it into the foreground of our blend. Now, immediately you'll see this looks a bit crazy. That's because we need to adjust our blend a little bit. So if I double click the blend and change the blending mode to subtract, that looks pretty cool, but it's kind of a bit much. So I'm just going to take the opacity down. And now you get to see we have more of a tactile feel to this grout. So I'm just going to adjust the opacity a little bit. You really don't need that much, because if you go too far, it's going to look fake. So let's bring the opacity down to something right around here. Now, right now, this grout looks like it was just laid and it's oozing out on top of our bricks. However, we know that grout is hard and cracks and chips. So let's add that effect onto it now. The way I'm going to do that is with a slope blur grayscale node. So I'm going to add one in right here, spacebar, slope blur grayscale. And in the slope input, I'm going to add a crystal 1. So this is our crystal noise. It's an extremely useful noise, very useful for rocks and for chipping things. So if I pump that into the slope, and I need to double click the slope blur, and if we just bring down the intensity quite a bit, you can start to see what it's doing. It's taking this noise and pushing the grout based on these gradients. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to increase the samples all the way up to 32, and I'm going to bring the intensity down very, very small, something like 0.2. And this still looks a bit intense. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to my crystal. I'm going to bring up that shape a bit. I'm going to bring down the scale to increase the size, something like 10. And then you can see that this slope is pushing the grout over these bricks, and I don't necessarily want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click my slope blur grayscale. I'm going to change the mode from blur to min. And you can see what that does now. Now only the inside of the shape is being affected. You can switch this to max. You'll see only the outside is getting affected, and blur does both. But I'm going to stick to min here. And now you can see we've got a little bit of chipping occurring. Finally, to finish up our grout here, at the end, after the slope blur grayscale, I'm going to add a levels node. So I added a levels node here because I'm thinking about the future and how I'm going to blend this height with my bricks and all the other things. So one thing you can do with the levels node is you can take this bottom right triangle and you can adjust the overall brightness of everything connected before it. And so you can really bring it down and adjust how intense it is on the height. So with that in mind, we can add levels nodes, or you can do the same thing with the histogram scan node, and you can adjust how far out the grout is. So you can choose, you can have a sloppily made brick wall where the grout's all over the place, or you could have a much cleaner wall where the grout is between the bricks, which we'll get to in a bit, because right now we're just looking at the grout. So I added this levels node, but I'm not going to touch it because I'm going to use it later on. So here's our grout, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to frame up everything between tile sampler and before our final blend. So I'm going to select all these nodes, hit spacebar, and type frame. And now if I go to the title, I'm just going to call this grout. Just a way to keep organized here. So I let the tile sampler out because we're going to use it for something else. But let's just put the grout up here for now, and let's make some more room. And let's go on to the bricks. So for the bricks, I'm going to start off with our already made tile sampler. Because one of the cool things about Substance Designer is if you change this tile sampler, then the rest of everything that comes after it is going to update. And this demonstrates the procedural power of Substance Designer. So we're starting off with this tile sampler. And what I'm going to do right away is I'm going to drag off here and let go. And this is just another way to add nodes. And I'm going to add an edge detect. So this edge detect node finds all of the edges between all of these shapes, and we can adjust some of the parameters here. So if I double click the edge detect, you can see this is what we have. And what I want to do is I want to refine and focus in a little bit on these bricks so that they don't clash with our grout. So with my properties here under the edge detect, I'm going to make my edge width just a tiny bit smaller. So to see what we're doing, I'm going to go over here, select this connection, and I'm going to hit spacebar and add a blend. And I'm going to set this blend to add. And I'm doing this so that I can see what I'm doing in my 3D view while I'm working. So I'm going to take our edge detect, and I'm just going to connect it to the foreground of this new blend here. So you can see what we've done. Now, it looks a bit intense. That's okay. We're going to refine this a bit. So you'll notice if I increase the edge width of our bricks, they're sitting right in with our grout. That's because we're using the same tile sampler here. So let's just zoom in and let's make sure the edge width is nice and snug with our grout. We can also adjust the roundness of these edges. So if I bring this in, you can get a rounder kind of brick, if that's what you're going for, or you can have a completely square brick. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add just a tiny bit of edge roundness so that these bricks catch some highlights. So let's adjust it to something like that, where it's just a tiny bit round on the corners there. And now after this, we're going to add a distance node. Now the distance node is really cool. It takes these pixels, these brick pixels, and it searches for a way to expand them so that they touch the next island of pixels. So if I go into my distance node, you can see if I just bring the maximum distance down to 0 and then slowly bring it up, you can see that it expands our bricks out. So I'm just doing it a tiny bit to get this bit of a bevel, which you can see is going on here. And then I'm going to focus in this shape with a histogram scan. Histogram scan. And if I bring up the position, you see it tightens up our shape here, similar to what a levels node can do. And you can adjust the contrast as well. And now we're going to warp these bricks with the same directional warp that we had from our grout so that everything seems to conform together. So I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to find our directional warp that we had from the grout, and I'm going to hit Control D to duplicate it. Just drag it over here. And I'm going to select these connectors and just delete that for now. So what that means is this directional warp has the same parameters that we've already set. So it has the same angle and the same intensity. So if I take the histogram scan and put that into our input, and then I use the same purlin noise that we had from our grout and make that drive the directional warp so that we have those same swirls, and let's put this directional warp into the foreground of this blend here that we have connected to our final blend so that we can see what we're doing in our 3D view. So you can see our bricks are now following the same path as our grout. And I'm just going to take the intensity of our new directional warp and just bring it down a bit. So if I adjust our intensity a bit, you see we're getting a bit of a getting our wavy bricks here. And now that I'm looking at my material, I think that the bricks are just a tiny bit too close together. So to fix that, I'm going to go back to our histogram scan that's between our distance and our directional warp. And I'm going to just bring the position down. And if you see what that does, if I bring this down, you can see that the bricks are getting a bit smaller. I'm going to choose something around 0.53. And now you can see we've got some more space around it. And I use histogram scan nodes all the time to focus in things or to create masks. So that's a great example of just adjusting and refining the shape a little bit. So I'm going to bring down the directional warp just a little bit more so that we have something a bit more like this. So you can always adjust this based on what you're looking for, but I'm looking for a slight wave so it's easier to see a more defined shape like this when you're further away from it. And lastly, for the base brick shape, I'm going to add a levels for the same reason that we added one last time, so that we can adjust the height offset later on. So this is our base brick shape. And now it's time to reshape them a little bit to add more character and more of that brick tactile feel. Okay, so to keep organized, I'm going to select our nodes here, hit spacebar, frame them up, and I'm just going to call this bricks. So now that we have the basic shape of our bricks, let's deform them a little in order to give them a bit more depth and character. Older bricks have harsh plane changes and weathered valleys across the surface. So to recreate this, we're going to cut out some bits and pieces from our bricks. And to start off, we're going to use a tile sampler. So click off into your graph somewhere, hit spacebar, type in tile sampler. And for this tile sampler, we're going to decrease the X amount to something like 8 and 8. And I'm going to change the pattern to paraboloid. And I'm going to bring up the scale. So if I go down to size and go to scale, let's zoom in here. So I'm actually going to bring up the scale quite a bit, something like 3.2. And the magic happens if we scroll down to position and we go to position random and we increase that. You can see we're getting this sort of organic, cellular, mushy pattern here. So you can put this at pretty much wherever you'd like it to be. I'm going to keep it somewhere around here. And what you can also do is you can go up to scale and adjust the scale random value and adjust it even further. This tile sampler is going to cut out shapes from our bricks. So to do that, I'm going to select the connection that's going into this blend. So we know that this blend is combining the bricks with the grout. So I'm going to select the connection that's coming out of our brick shapes, add a new blend. I'm going to set this to subtract. And what we're going to subtract by putting in the foreground is this tile sampler. Now, immediately you'll see this has some pretty dire consequences, but you can start to get an idea of what's going on here. So let's go to this blend and let's bring the opacity down. And if you press Control, Shift, and right click, you can rotate the light source. You can start to see what's going on. You can also rotate the shape by just left clicking and moving around. You can zoom in with the scroll wheel. So I can adjust this opacity and you can decide how defined you want these plane changes and cut shapes to be. I'm going to pick something pretty close to 50, maybe 0.55%. And to disrupt this shape even further, I'll take this blend and move it over a little bit. And after that blend, I'm going to add a slope blur grayscale. You see it automatically put into the grayscale input our blend here, but the slope amount is what drives this effect. So in this slope amount, I'm going to hit spacebar and add a cells 4. This is what the cells 4 noise looks like. And you can change the scale. You can make it more complicated, less complicated. I'm actually going to make it a bit more complicated by increasing the scale parameter. And then after this cells, I'm going to add a blur high quality grayscale. And we can adjust this intensity a little bit. Now we can take that output and put it into the slope input of our slope blur. Double click on our slope blur and we can adjust its settings here. So I'm going to decrease the intensity quite a bit. Almost to nothing. And if I zoom in here, let's see what's going on. That looks pretty crazy. How about 0.05? And I'm going to set the mode to min because I don't want it to affect anything outside of the brick. And we can increase the samples just to add some quality here. And you can see what's going on now. Now our brick shapes have these indents. So this was before the slope blur. This is after. Adds these cuts and these ridges. Now you've probably noticed these strange lines appearing on our bricks. That's because we're getting a bit of a clashing height going on here. You can see that our grout is actually clashing a little bit with our brick. And we're going to have to subtract our brick shape from our grout a little bit so that they fit together better and we don't have a conflicting height issue going on here. So in order to fix that, I'm going to go to this levels. And this levels is the one that's at the end of our bricks. And whether or not you're using the levels or not, you might be just going from the directional warp out from here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick my last node, which is in this case a levels. I'm going to right click and say add comment. I like to do this because we're going to use this quite a bit as a mask for our brick shape. So I'm just going to call this brick mask. So now you can see that comment here. And that comment, since we right clicked on our levels, is going to stick with that node. So I'm just going to bring it up close there. So now that we have this brick mask, we can use it to cut out shapes by setting a blend node to subtract. So really what we want to do is we want to take this grout and subtract our brick shape. So I'm going to take this blend that we've been using. In the background, we have our grout. In the foreground, we have our bricks, and it's set to add. I'm just going to bring this next to our final output here. And what I'm going to do is, after the levels from our grout, I'm going to select that connection and add a new blend. And this blend is going to be set to subtract. And what are we subtracting? Our brick mask. So let's take that brick mask, put it into the foreground, and immediately you can see what happened here. The brick mask has subtracted itself from the grout, and now it perfectly sets in with our brick. So I'm just going to make a little bit more room here so we can organize a bit better. Now this new blend is the one that subtracts our bricks from the grout, then goes into this blend, which adds in the rest of our bricks. So to keep ourselves organized now, I'm going to take our tile sampler and all of these nodes down here with the cells and slope blur, everything like that. I'm just going to group them up, frame them, and call it reshape bricks. So far so good. If I go to materials, default, and hit edit, and then bring up the scale, we can add a little bit of height to our viewport here and see our bricks and grout sticking out a bit more. So now I want to add an extra level of detail to the bricks because right now they're looking very smooth and we want to start adding a tactile, bumpy feel to them. So if we go to the reshape bricks frame that we have here and we go to the slope blur grayscale, and after that, let's add another blend node. And it's set to copy, which is what we want it to be at. And in the foreground, we're going to add a clouds to noise. So if I double click that, you can see we've got this interesting puffy, organic looking noise here, and you can adjust the disorder and play around with that. I'm going to increase the scale to something like, 4 to get more detail here. And I'm going to pump that into the foreground of the blend. Now it's looking a bit crazy right now and it's happening everywhere and it's all a mess. What I want to do is blend nodes also have an opacity mask input. And so we're going to be using our brick mask as that opacity input. So let's connect it now, bring it out, and I'm using the middle mouse button to click and pan while I'm holding the left mouse button, and I'm plopping it into the opacity mask. So now it's just happening on the bricks. And if we click on our blend here, we can bring the opacity down and fine tune how much noise and detail we're getting. You really don't need that much, so I'm going to probably set it, let's set it to about 0.1. That's looking good. And to add a bit more diversity and noise to this, I'm going to add a blend after this. And I'm going to set this blend node to subtract. And in the foreground, I'm going to get another clouds 2. I'm going to keep it default the way it is and put it into the foreground. And then I'm going to do the same thing I did before. Just grab that levels or your brick mask and put that into the opacity. And I'm going to decrease the opacity of this blend so that we can, again, adjust how much it's subtracting from our bricks. You see, if I go too far, it really affects the height of our bricks overall. So I'm just going to dial it in a bit. And now we have a bunch of plane changes here, and it's really starting to look organic. Now, you'll notice a couple things are happening here. While we keep subtracting from our bricks, the height is going down and down and down. If we look at it right now, actually, you can see it's getting pretty dark. And this is where our levels nodes come in handy here. So we're going to do a couple things. First off, if I preview this on let's say we preview it on a sphere, sphere 2 tiles. The texture is quite large, actually. And you can see that our bricks are quite big. And what I want to do is uniformly scale down our material so that it tiles, but also shows more bricks at a time. So what I can do here is before we get to our final blend, right here we have everything plugged into this blend, which is then going into our final blend into our outputs. So between these two, I'm going to add a transform 2D. And the transformation 2D node has a really handy feature. If we go down here to where we have these times 2 and divide by 2 option. So we hit divide by 2 once. You can see it evenly scales it down, still tiles. And if you look on our sphere, we have many more bricks appearing. Now, let's change this back to our rounded cube here. This has enhanced a bit of our problem even more. You can see that the grout is sticking far out from our bricks. So let's go back and we can go to our levels here at the end of our grout. And we single click on that. I'm going to take that bottom right arrow down until now you can see that the grout is starting to appear behind the bricks. You can zoom in a bit, and if I can show you what's happening here. If you increase it, you can see it sticking out, and you can just refine the grout a little bit here. So now it looks like it's part of the wall behind the bricks a bit, and the bricks look like they're about to pop out, which is great. Remember, you can do the same thing with our brick mask, in this case, with our levels, and you can bring that down, and now you can see the bricks are going down. So you can control, you don't do too much now, but you can control the height specifically of the bricks or the grout to get the kind of look that you're going for. And so now that we've decreased the size and we've basically tiled our material twice, and that has an effect on the overall height scale of our scene. So I'm going to go to Materials, Default, Edit. And what I can do is I can just bring our viewport displacement scale down a little bit to kind of normalize us back to what we had before. So to continue keeping ourselves organized, let's select our clouds and our blends here, frame them up, and I'm going to call this Surface Noise. Make sure to give your material a save there, Control S. And now it's time to add just one more detail to our bricks, and that's some cracks and chipping onto the bricks themselves. So I'm going to make some more room here. Just bring everything out, and I'm going to hit spacebar, and I'm going to add another tile sampler. So this tile sampler is going to be a bit different. So if we double click our tile sampler, I'm going to add a bit more to the X amount. Let's go with 30, and we'll do 30 for the Y amount as well. I'm going to change the pattern to disc, so it's more like a bunch of circles. We're going to go to the size and bring the scale really far down, something like that, and scroll down a bit more and crank up that position random. The idea is that you don't want most of these circles to touch one another, so you can adjust the offset as well to try and help you out a bit. And finally, in the tile sampler, let's scroll all the way down, and where it says color random, bring that all the way to 1. So now you can see all of our dots have multiple grayscale values. I'm now going to add a histogram scan, and I'm going to connect the tile sampler to it, and I'll just bring the position all the way up and the contrast all the way up. I'm going to move this up here. I'm also going to add a distance node in, and I'm going to connect the histogram scan into the mask input, and then I'm going to bring the tile sampler into the source input. So you can see we've got all these different colors and weird shapes going on. If I double click the distance node and just crank up the maximum distance, in fact, you can crank it up even more to something like 900. As long as you're not getting some weird, like half circle-y shapes, just crank that up as much as you can so you can get these clean lines. So let's see what's going on here. If after our surface noise, if we select that connection and add another blend, and we can set this to subtract. Let's just take our distance and put that into the foreground. See kind of what's going on here a bit. Let's bring the opacity of our new blend down. Now you get this sort of chipping, cracked effect. But what's happening is, if you look closely, you can see that all of these shapes are kind of all following each other. They're all flowing from one to the next because it looks as if we just stamped on this cracking effect onto our bricks. And that's not really what it looks like in the real world. So we kind of want to displace and move this effect over each brick separately or with different values. And what we're going to do is use the flood fill nodes to fix that. Okay, so hit spacebar and type in flood fill. Now, this flood fill node takes a mask input, which means we need something like our brick mask here, which has completely white and completely black values. We also need to make sure that the shapes inside this mask have sort of these islands so that none of these bricks or anything have anything touching. So for the flood fill node, let's take our brick mask and we'll drag it into the input of the flood fill. And if I double click, you'll see we've got these islands that have these different colors on them. You can see that the flood fill has detected that these shapes aren't touching each other and they're all separate. So after the flood fill node, I'm going to add a flood fill to grayscale node. And you'll see there's nothing happening, but if we take the luminance adjustment, bring it all the way to the right to 1, and then we take the luminance random all the way to -1, you can see our bricks have different luminance and grayscale values here. So this is great because what we can do is we can get a directional warp, and in the intensity input, we can put in this flood fill to grayscale. We can then take our distance node and put that into the input of our directional warp. And if we increase the intensity here, you'll see that the warp is occurring at different rates based on the grayscale value from our flood fill to grayscale. So we can go crazy here. We can crank this up to something like 60, and then you can see now those shapes are moving at different rates. So now, if we go to our blend that we used originally, which has our surface noise and what we were using as our cracks before, if we replace the foreground of that blend, you'll see now that we don't have the problem that we had before. None of those shapes are running into each other. In fact, to make it even better, if we go to that directional warp and we change the warp angle to something not so, like something in the bottom left corner here, now you can see that the cracks are all different on each of the bricks. That's all fine and good, but I don't want all of my bricks to have cracks. So we can use this flood fill to grayscale to create a mask where we can choose which bricks have cracks and which don't. So what we can do is if I click somewhere in the graph, hit spacebar, and get our histogram scan node, and I can plug in our flood fill to grayscale into the histogram scan and bring up the position and also bring up the contrast. So if I bring the contrast all the way up to 1 and then adjust the position, I can now choose how many bricks in my pattern I want to have cracks, and this creates our mask for us. So 0.32 is good for me here, and we can plug that histogram scan into the opacity input of our blend. So now we can see that some bricks have cracks while others do not. And you can choose the opacity of this blend to decide how much of the cracks and chipping you want. I'm actually going to make it very subtle. You really only see it on an angle. Yeah, so 0.5 is going to be fine. So like before, let's select all of these chipping cracks nodes, frame them up, and let's give it a name, brick cracks. And so now we've pretty much completed the height of our entire texture here. So we've got our cracks, we've got the grout with some texture, we've got some broken up texture, there's some planes in here that kind of weather the bricks a bit. And we're starting to get a more complete picture of what our brick wall texture is going to be. The last thing I want to do is adjust some of the roughness and give some color to our bricks. So let's do that. Let's find where we have our bricks and where we have our grout. So this blend right here seems to just have our bricks, and this one here has our grout. So let's make some comments here. I'm going to right click our grout blend here and choose add comment and just call it grout. Then I'm going to go to our bricks blend, right click, comment, bricks, and then this one combines the two. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my graph, hit spacebar, and get a gradient map. You see it's the first one there. And I'm going to bring our bricks and input it into the gradient map. So this gradient map's pretty cool. If you go to the gradient editor, what we can do is we can add some keys here. So we can make this one red, add another key, make this one green, and it maps it to the black and white values here. So you can just adjust these and you can move them around and it's going to remap itself. Now, clearly that doesn't look that great. So I'm going to hit clear all. And so that we can see what we're doing in our 3D view, I'm going to exit out of that and I'm going to connect the gradient map to the base color output here. Now you'll notice something weird happens. Let's get rid of this uniform color. You'll notice that this doesn't quite match up with what's going on. That's because you have to remember we're transforming our bricks to tile them down basically twice. So we can just do the same thing here. If I just Control D, duplicate that transformation 2D, I can bring in the gradient map and then bring the output into the base color. And now you can see it matches up perfectly. So now we can see what's happening in our 3D view. Let's double click the gradient map, go to the gradient editor, and instead of manually adjusting these colors, we can choose pick gradient. So let me show you what I mean in a second. So I've gone to Google and I've found an image of bricks with some grout here with some neat colors that I like. And so if I go into Substance Designer and I go back into my gradient editor, I can go to pick gradient here. If I just click and drag my cursor, it's going to pick all those colors and apply them to this gradient and map them for us. So I can see what's going on here. That looks interesting. And what we can do is we can invert the positions and get the opposite of what's going on. And I can go and pick another gradient. So let's choose something a bit darker. Getting something like that. That's actually not looking that bad. It's got a good color range, but you can see we've got some weirdness going on here. Let's see what we can do with what we got here. If I drag a selection of these keys, I can move them around. You can see what that's doing to our texture. That's interesting. In fact, I wonder what would happen if I just inverted it. Nah, that's not quite right. So I'm going to select these keys and I'm going to click and drag up to delete them. And then you can do the same thing here. You can just move these around, sort of play around with the kind of detail that you're looking for here. That's cool. I don't really like the light colors, so I'm going to drag those up. Maybe space these out differently. Delete that lighter color here. The tighter you make these keys, the sharper they're going to appear on your gradient. So maybe I'll just extend this a bit. You can also select a key and go to this. This is a hue, saturation, value, and opacity. So if I just bring the value down, I can just darken it specifically. You can also select all of them and lower the value as well, or the opacity. We can move this around. I'm just looking at the bricks. I know the grout is colored. We'll fix that in a second. So let's stick with that for now. Next up, we need to color the grout. So how are we going to do that? Well, we need to create a mask for just the grout. So let's go back to where we had that blend. And if we double click the blend, you see this isn't really quite a mask. It's got some grayscale values to it, and it's not quite as precise as we'd like it to be. So to create a mask, I'm going to hit spacebar and get a histogram scan. And I'm going to connect it to the input there and just bring the position all the way up, the contrast all the way up. And so now I have a nice clean mask. And I'm going to keep this transform right up next to this base color. Maybe just like that. And let's add a blend between our gradient map from before and the transform 2D. And let's put our histogram scan of our grout in as the opacity. And nothing's happening, but that's because let's just add a uniform color here, something like, let's just black. Put that in the foreground. And so now you can see, yeah, just our grout is being affected by this color or by this foreground in our blend. So you could go ahead and pick a new gradient map for the grout, which is what I'd recommend because you get more variation in the color. But in this case, I'm just going to go to the uniform color and increase the value so that we get something a bit brighter. And you want to look at this from multiple angles because it does get affected by the light. And it also gets affected by the roughness. So you can see as I move this around, we're getting that severe highlight here because the surface itself is extremely shiny. It's not very rough. So if we went all the way over to our roughness output here and our uniform color that's driving it, if you increase this and bring it towards white, the material gets a bit more rough. So I like to keep mine a bit shinier than maybe what you would expect in the real world. You can do whatever you would like to do for your project. However, I just want to be able to see that there's a highlight occurring. So if I do that, you can still see a bit of that light reflecting off of it. You get sort of that hardness that you're looking for. And so now I can go over to that uniform color for the grout, and I can go back to the value, and I can make it lighter or darker. I don't want it too light here. Zoom out. And this is kind of what we're looking at now as our brick material. Again, you can go to that uniform color that's driving your roughness. You can also use this slider. Bring it down for a bit more of a shiny look. Just dial it in and right about here. And if I control, shift, right click, I can move the light around. Yeah, I'm just gonna fiddle with that a little bit. You can also go to your ambient occlusion, which is connected to your ambient occlusion map, and adjust the height depth. So if I increase it, you can get like a really grungy, dirty looking brick wall, or you can bring it back down, something like this, and even it out a little. It really doesn't take that much when it comes to the height depth and the ambient occlusion. And there you have it. So now we have our brick wall material. What's neat about this is because it's procedural, if we go back all the way to the beginning, we go to our tile sampler, double click on that. And if I change, let's say the X amount to 4, we can make smaller bricks, or if I go back to 3, but then I make this 8, you see we have much thinner bricks. And all you have to do is change one slider and the rest of the material propagates and creates that desired result that you're looking for without tweaking anything else. We can then look at it on, say, a rounded cylinder. And here it is on the sphere. And there you go. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this tutorial helped you better understand some of the inner workings of Substance Designer and how to create your textures from scratch using some simple shapes and then narrowing it down into more and more complex features. It's kind of funny, I just moved to London and today it is 96 degrees. So if it seems like I'm talking a bit fast, it's probably because there's no air conditioning here and it's extremely hot. But I'm having a great time making some textures, setting up the new office, and yeah, so it's been a great process moving. I have a vlog coming that I want to make that kind of explains where this channel is going and sort of the future of what videos are going to be on this channel. If you liked this video, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more tutorials from me, and hit the bell to be notified when I post new videos. Until next time, I'll see you in the next one.